Hi, I'm David Dodge. Welcome to Green Energy Futures. A new report called Powering Canada's Journey to Net Zero says solar, wind, and energy storage can provide the zero emissions electricity needed to take the nation's buildings, transportation, and industry to net zero. With electrification of vehicles and home heating on the horizon, Canada needs to decarbonize its electricity grid and double its production of electricity. The good news is the renewable energy is cheap, but Canada's grid desperately needs to be modernized to embrace energy storage, electric vehicles, and smart grid technologies to make it happen. Robert Horning is president and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, and his organization has just published their vision and a to-do list to help Canada get to net zero.
My name is Robert Horning. I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association.
Robert, at a very high level, tell me about the report you guys have just done and what it's all about. Just very high level, because it saved the best parts. We got more to come.
Well, I mean, what we wanted to do was to look at what role wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage would play in moving Canada towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions across the economy by 2050. And from our perspective, you know, there's a broad consensus that to get there, you're going to need to decarbonize your electricity system and then expand electricity production to allow that electricity to be used to decarbonize transportation, buildings, and industry. And we really wanted to get an understanding of what that meant in practical terms for the scale up of wind, solar, and storage that we need to see in Canada to make net zero a reality.
That's great. So, Robert, when I look at the title, it's funny. When I see this come across my desk, I've seen many reports like this with the title with vision in them. And sometimes when we see the word vision, it's something we can, but probably will never achieve. Is this really a vision of something that can be done, or is this a to-do list for electricity generation in order to meet Canada's goals?
Well, it's sort of a both. It's not. It's definitely something I would say that can be done, but more importantly, has to be done if we're serious about meeting net zero by 2050. So from our perspective, it is something that we can achieve, but it's not something that's going to happen just on its own. And that's why you have a to-do list, because the to-do list creates the conditions that enables the investment required to ensure that we build enough wind, solar, and energy storage to allow net zero to be achieved.
Well, as I said before, Robert, I love that your report is pretty clear and simple. It's a pretty clear and simple task list that it really is addressing, you know, a pretty complicated thing that we need to do, you know, between now and 2050. Let's go through it. Because the report's so well organized, let's go through it step by step and address each of the things that you guys bring up. So what's the first task?
Well, the first task is to decarbonize our electricity system. And we state that what we want to see is to have our electricity system decarbonized by 2035 and use a couple of tools to do that. Implement a clean electricity standard federally that sets a greenhouse gas emission reduction sort of intensity for electricity generation, which should be down to zero by 2035, and also ensure that carbon pricing is actually fully applied in the electricity sector. Right now, existing natural gas plants in Canada are largely sheltered from the carbon price, and that provides very little incentive to look at alternatives or to try and reduce emissions from within those systems. Taking those two foundational measures together can move us towards decarbonization of the system by 2035, which then allows us to reap the benefits of that when we use that electricity to electrify other sectors.
Great. And so let's talk about one of the implications of that in a second. But Robert, remind me where we're at in Canada right now. It's actually, to many people, it's kind of surprising where we're at because it's so different depending on where you live in the country. Break it down. Where are we at in Canada in terms of the electricity grid and carbon and decarbonization?
So the good news is that Canada has one of the most decarbonized electricity systems in the world today. We have 80% of our electricity comes from non-emitting sources. We've also seen a dramatic reduction in emissions from the electricity sector, 48% reduction since 2005, largely due to the phase out of coal in Ontario. So we've made significant progress. In fact, electricity only accounts for 8% of Canada's national emissions at this time. But that does vary from province to province. We have jurisdictions like Quebec, Newfoundland, British Columbia, Manitoba that are almost getting 100% of their electricity from non-emitting sources. Then we have provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, which rely much more heavily on coal and natural gas to provide that electricity. And if we're going to decarbonize the system as a whole, it's in those provinces where we've got a lot of work to do.
I guess part of that story is a good news story too, because one of the worst places is the place I live here in Alberta in terms of, we were 70 or 80% coal less than 10 years ago. And we're going to be without coal, completely beyond coal by 2023, which is rather stunning, like it was in Ontario when they rapidly decommissioned all the coal. But part of what they're talking about now is replacing a lot of that with gas. And so the first two factors you talked about kind of relate to this. What is the risk of using natural gas as this bridge, but locking into it for the long term?
Well, and that's the challenge, really, right? At the end of the day, natural gas will provide you with short-term emission reductions when you're using it to replace coal. But electricity infrastructure is long-lived. If you build a natural gas plant, you're going to want to run that thing for 25, 30, 40 years. And we don't have 25, 30, 40 years to run natural gas plants at this point in time. So when we look ahead, we think that there is going to be a role for natural gas. Every model that looks at net zero greenhouse gas emissions does envision a role for natural gas. But that natural gas is usually accompanied by carbon capture and storage to reduce its emissions impact. And it's also something that we use very infrequently. It's only to fill those few hours in a year where we have a concern around reliability in the absence of gas, and we use it for that purpose. So investing significantly in natural gas in terms of seeing it as playing a load in terms of a base load and things like that going forward is not what most of the models expect, because it will not be the most cost-effective way to deliver emissions-free power going forward.
So I don't want to belabor this too long because we got lots to cover, but how do we avoid locking into that then? Because it's not clear to me now that we're on a track to avoid locking into those emissions.
Well, if we think about, we're looking for the least cost way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and get to net zero. And so that's why wind and solar are going to play a large role, a central role, because they're the lowest cost technologies to produce electricity, decarbonized or carbonized today, going forward. So then when we look at that scenario and we say, okay, well, some people will argue we need to use natural gas to ensure the reliability of the system. But one of the things that's really interesting is that all of this change is happening at a time when we've got a whole range of disruptive technologies entering the electricity sector. Energy storage, distributed energy resources, demand side resources coming forward. And these all can also play a role in ensuring the reliability of the system. And so what we need to really think about is, and we talk about this in our vision, is that we need to restructure our market frameworks, our regulatory frameworks, to ensure that all technologies that can provide services that contribute to the reliability of the system have an opportunity to do so. Right now, there's many barriers that prevent that from happening. And more importantly is that when those opportunities are there, that they're allowed to compete for those opportunities. And we're quite confident that in looking for those lowest cost solutions, we're going to find there's a much broader range of alternatives out there than simply natural gas to provide that reliability. It could be building new transmission linkages. It could be other forms of non-emitting generation. It could be through the use of energy storage. It could be through the use of distributed energy resources. Let's bring all of those to the table and find the most cost-effective way forward. As I said, there likely will be a role for gas. It'll likely need to be associated with carbon capture and storage, and will likely be smaller than, it'll be a small role likely by 2050.
Well, Robert, I love the way you've segued into your second task. That was very clever. It may sound boring, your second task, but modernizing electricity markets and regulatory structures is really key to this, isn't it? Let's talk about some of the implications here. What about pricing? How is pricing involved in getting it right?
Well, it's more, in some ways, it's more a sense of, we have in Alberta an energy-only market right now, and energy tends to be the main market that we use within the electricity sector. We don't necessarily value to the same extent reliability or a variety of services that ensure reliability. And therefore, when new technologies come along that can provide those services, if they don't also provide energy, or their primary function is not providing energy, it's hard for them to actually generate the revenue streams required to actually enable them to go forward and get built out. And in a world where you have more and more wind and solar coming onto the grid, which is essentially zero cost energy going forward, we're going to need, for all types of generation, we're going to need other sources of revenue. It's not just going to be from the sale of energy going forward that we do that. And so there's a real need for us to think about what are these ancillary services, these additional services that the electricity grid needs to operate safely, reliably going forward. And if technologies have the opportunity to participate in those markets, they will emerge and try to take advantage of that opportunity. And these are disruptive technologies. They're fundamentally changing the way we think. Energy storage is a technology that is potentially both a load, pulling energy in. It's potentially a source of generation, feeding energy into the grid. And it also can help offset transmission by sort of serving that storage role. And so in many market structures, energy storage is very difficult to deal with because these structures have been built around, well, there's generation, there's load, and there's transmission. And here's a technology that plays in all three of those spaces. And that requires some new work. And in fact, to its credit, the Alberta government just last week introduced new legislation, which for the first time seeks to define energy storage in legislative terms so that it's then possible to develop a regulatory framework that will allow it to participate in these markets going forward. And the work that has gone on to try and figure out how we're going to fit energy storage in Alberta is having an impact. 2 years ago, if you looked at the queue for the Alberta Electric System Operator, you saw very little energy storage projects being proposed. There's now 2,500 megawatts of energy storage projects proposed in Alberta, waiting for the finalization of this regulatory framework so that they can come in and provide these services that will enable Alberta to continue to grow its renewable energy base in wind and solar going forward.
What I love about this topic is that you've just scratched the surface. So we're talking about energy storage now, which actually is a rather big door with a lot behind it. But there's another area, and that is smart homes and smart grids. There's a company in Montreal called DC, as in direct current DC Bell, that's just come onto the market with a very innovative vehicle, DC charging vehicle device that is a solar inverter and an AI-powered smart energy management device. And guess what? They're not even selling it in Canada, thanks to our, what I would euthanize as dumb grids. They're selling it into New York, California, and Texas, where the grids are literally blowing up because of high penetration rates of EVs and solar. What kind of a role are these smart home devices and smart grid devices going to play?
They're going to play a really important role, but being able to capitalize on them will require some of the market and regulatory reform we talked about. It will also require changes in the way we operate the electricity system. So, for example, the electricity system operator in Alberta has very little visibility of what's going on that distributed side behind the meter. They need to better see that to be able to manage it and use it going forward. So there are reforms that we need to pursue in order to enable that. But there's an explosion really of technologies that are emerging here that have the opportunity to allow us to be much smarter in how we manage electricity, how we utilize electricity, the efficiency with which we use it going forward. And we're just at the cusp of moving from this sort of traditional framework of a one-way electricity system, big facility, transmission line, here's a user at the end, to having a two-way electricity system, where at that side too, there's also going to be generation. It feeds into the grid. There's also going to be the opportunity to provide reliability services into the grid. And again, bringing all of those players together will give us many more options, which will give us many more pathways and allow us to find lower cost pathways going forward.
And these don't involve huge investments. A lot of these smart technologies, unlike grid infrastructure of the past, I'm aware of one example in Summerside, Prince Edward Island, for example, a have-not province when it comes to energy generation. In fact, they only just discovered wind power about 10 years ago, and really that's all they have aside from diesel generation, although I guess they're playing with solar now. But in Summerside, they actually flattened the curve on wind energy with a very simple smart grid installation that used thermal energy storing furnaces, electric furnaces, instead of oil furnaces. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about as well?
Yeah, and in fact, it's a nice segue into another one of our our recommendations coming out of our vision statement. And that is that when we talk about the need to significantly expand the electricity grid going forward, which will need to happen, that is going to require infrastructure investment. We are going to need to build new transmission. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Transmission is expensive. It takes a long time to build. It's difficult to build. And therefore, we want to try and minimize that to the greatest extent possible. And that means we have to use our existing transmission system much more efficiently. And that we can do through increased use of non-wire alternatives, which are some of the things that you've highlighted and what we can do with distributed energy resources, where at the end of the day, a transmission system is built to carry the power needed at a peak time. But we're only at that peak time for a really small percentage of hours in the overall time, which means for most of the time, the transmission system is underutilized. We actually have more space on the transmission system than we're able to use. So if we can lower that peak, that means that we're able to use that transmission system for longer and more efficiently, and helps to defer or perhaps even avoid the need to build new transmission, which is really something we want to do. Again, as I said, we're going to need new transmission, no doubt about it, but to the extent that we can minimize that new build, all the better. And again, that requires us to really think about how we can use all of these. You mentioned, the EV that's sitting in the driveway and the battery that's sitting in there, and using that as well as part of this larger integrated grid. All of these things can help us to be much more efficient in our use of infrastructure, and again, help to reduce the costs of moving down this journey towards net zero.
This is kind of a new approach to building infrastructure. I mean, in the old days, they used to say, we can buy you a tiny fraction of a percentage of increased reliability by doing a massive grid infrastructure upgrade, which costs us a lot of money. Avoiding doing this obviously saves a lot of money. But we do need some grid infrastructure improvement. And part of that, I think you allude to in the report, is interjurisdictional. Why is that important?
It's important because you gain efficiencies by collaboration and working together. Essentially, you broaden your range of options. In Canada, we have 10 provinces, 10 electricity systems and markets, and everyone who's associated in that market, the system operator, is doing their best job to optimize their system. And the only problem is that when we optimize each of the 10 systems individually, the one thing we're sure of is that nationally we have a suboptimal outcome because we ignore all the possibilities for collaboration to go forward. So at the end of the day, in a province like Canada, where we have carbon-intensive electricity systems sitting right beside hydro-intensive electricity systems, there are tremendous opportunities right there in terms of looking for ways to help reduce emissions going forward to do that. As you bring a lot of new variable generation onto the grid and you're figuring out how to manage that reliably, having larger balancing areas gives you the opportunity to do that. So if the wind is dropping off in your jurisdiction and you're needing new power, it may be that the wind is blowing enormously in the province next door. And therefore, you're able to use some of that power if you have those interconnections. So again, the broader the system, the more tools the system operator has to ensure and pursue a reliable system going forward. And in fact, what most of the net zero analysis will say is that you get significant benefits, not only from better interconnection between systems, but even thinking of, are there opportunities to look at more coordinated operation between systems to enable, again, those cost-effective outcomes. And the reason I'm actually optimistic about all this is because I think at the end of the day, when we're looking at the scale of effort that's going to be required, and we'll come back to that, I think, before the end of this, when we're looking at the scale of effort that's required, the need and the desire to find the lowest cost solutions is going to be pretty strong because we're looking at such a scaling up. And it's going to be those pressures that I think will say we need to look at options like non-wires alternatives. We need to look at interjurisdictional transmission because we need to bring those costs down.
So really, a province like Alberta, which always doesn't always get along with British Columbia, but that really should be a marriage made in heaven, shouldn't it? Because British Columbia has massive hydro resources. We have massive solar and wind potential.
Yeah, it should be. It's as everything. It's not always straightforward and not uncomplicated. And the fact that you have two very different electricity market structures in Alberta and BC does complicate the situation significantly. But I think we often look at that as sort of, well, that means we can't do anything. I think it likely means we can't do everything. But there is something in between, and there's a lot more pressure on us right now to find out what that in between is.
But as you've already said, we need a lot of regulatory and administrative changes to the system. And you when you talked about that, we didn't talk about Alberta. Why is Alberta, ironically, one of the best places to build wind and solar today, and what can we learn from that?
Well, there's a couple of things that are unique about the Alberta market. One is clearly that for someone who wants to produce renewable energy, you have the opportunity to connect in. If you think you can play in the market and you can generate enough revenue to go ahead, you're able to connect, you're able to go forward. That doesn't happen in every province, because in every other province where you have a Crown corporation, you can only connect in if the Crown corporation says, I'm going to buy your power. So that's step one. But the other thing, and it's the other side of the same equation, is if you're a buyer of electricity in the Alberta market, you can also say, I would like to buy renewables. Who's willing to offer that to me? And a bunch of people can come forward and offer that. Again, when you're in a different province, it's going to be, will the Crown Corporation offer me renewables? Yes or no? And if not, I don't really have a choice. I'm going to take what the Crown Corporation is giving me. So that flexibility is what's been driving the market right now, because the Alberta market is being driven by really by the private sector, private demand for renewable energy, whether it's seeking that renewable energy to meet regulated commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through like the tier system in Alberta and carbon emissions, or whether it's companies who are seeking simply to reduce costs or seeking to meet ESG objectives, meeting their own commitments to internal commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Both of those are very powerful drivers, which are leading to tremendous opportunity. And in fact, it is leading other jurisdictions to look at how they can become more innovative in their procurement operations. So Nova Scotia, for example, is moving forward with a Green Choice program, which they're creating because a number of large electricity users in Nova Scotia have said, hey, we want an option to get this low-cost renewable energy. And so the Crown utility has thought, okay, how can we do that? How can we move that forward? Saskatchewan is now also looking at programs that will allow large industrial consumers of electricity to connect directly with electricity produced from renewable energy facilities. So we are seeing some evolution in this regard. And that's another reason why I think there's a lot of staying power behind some of these changes, is they're being driven from the bottom up. It's customers who want to see these things happen. And at the end of the day, whether you're a renewable energy producer or a Crown utility, you don't get anywhere unless you're serving the customer.
So, Robert, when we get these regulatory things right, and I'm not saying we got it right in Alberta, and maybe we accidentally got it right, at least for the times, but there was a fellow standing beside you when you guys released this vision not too long ago, who in fact is involved in one of the most interesting projects in probably renewable energy history in Canada that was facilitated by these regulatory structures. I'll let you tell me about that story.
So yeah, when we released our vision, one of the companies we had with us at the launch was Greengate Power. And Greengate Power is currently in Alberta building the largest solar project that we've seen in Canada going forward, and building that project to provide electricity to, again, corporations that are seeking to meet their own internal commitments. And in this case, the corporation is Amazon. And Amazon is one of the largest, obviously largest companies in the world, but also one of the companies that is most active in terms of seeking to decarbonize its electricity usage going forward. And for a company like Amazon, what has happened is that this is now a key factor in determining where it's going to site its facilities. And in fact, when the deal was announced in Alberta that Amazon was purchasing this power, they made it very explicit that one of the reasons that they are, interested in is this structure of the Alberta market that allows that. And subsequently, we've seen a major investment decision by Amazon to build new facilities in the province. And again, they stressed very much, the reason we're looking at doing this in Alberta is because we have strong commitments on the environment. We have strong commitments to use decarbonized electricity, and the Alberta market allows us to do that. And that's why we're here. And I think increasingly, countries, provinces are going to be dealing with a customer base, people who use electricity who are looking for that advantage to be able to compete internationally in a world where climate change and greenhouse gas emissions is of increasing interest to buyers. And at the end of the day, these companies want to position themselves for success. They want to be able to indicate that they are leading the charge in terms of our fight against climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And they are going to make investments in jurisdictions that allow them to do that. And as we mentioned earlier at the start of this discussion, Canada is in a very strong position. Relative to all the G7 countries, we have more decarbonized electricity as a percentage of our total grid than any of them. Even in provinces that are highly carbonized like Alberta, market structures are enabling a lot of new investment into renewable energy technologies going forward. This is something we should be actively seeking to capitalize on and move forth going forward, because it will position us as a haven for investment going forward.
So climate change is a nightmare. The task before us is enormous. But I think what you're talking about is what Mark Carney said. And he said, this is one of the greatest commercial opportunities of the modern era.
It absolutely is. I mean, and I guess this is a good segue perhaps when we talk about some of this scale and speed with which we need to move to be able to do this. So in our vision document, we said, okay, we just pulled together an illustrative scenario. It's informed by tons of research that's been done on net zero pathways, and it's consistent with that, but we wanted to put it into simple, plain terms so that people could understand. What we said is, okay, all the research says we probably need to double the size of our electricity grid to get to net zero. We know that wind and solar are the lowest cost source of new electricity and will be through 2050. Therefore, that's going to represent the biggest chunk of new generation that comes forward. And we said, we're going to assume it's 2/3. 2/3 of all new generation is going to be wind and solar. And then we said, okay, so what does that mean in practical terms? And we just ran through the numbers and we said, well, what it means is we need to build about 3,800 megawatts of wind and about 1,600 megawatts of solar capacity every year for the next 29 years to be able to get there. Now, if you look at how much you would build over 5 years and compare that to the last 5 years, that's a 9-fold increase in the rate of build that has to happen and be consistent over the next 29 years. And what we get into at the end of that is wind and solar expands 10-fold in Canada and amounts to at least a third of Canada's total electricity by that point in time. The scale and speed of that deployment is unprecedented. Like, we have not seen that before. So to enable that, that's why we have the to-do list. Because to make that happen, you need progress on all of the specific items we've identified. And the one we haven't touched on here, which I'll touch on now briefly, is we do need clear strategies to move forward to electrify our economy, right? If people are going to invest in building the new wind and solar that's going to be required to get to net zero, that investment is going to require them to be able to say, I can see that the demand is going to be there that justifies this investment. And if we don't have clarity on that, people will hold back. And we're starting to see some positive signs. We have commitments from the government in terms of banning the sale of internal combustion engines in passenger vehicles. We see in the private sector, we've seen, for example, announcements from steel and aluminum companies that they are moving to electrify their operations. So there are bits and pieces there that clearly indicate this is where we're going, but we need more clarity in terms of the speed and the rate at which that's going to happen so that we can plan the supply side accordingly. In many ways, the supply side is the easier part. We can actually build this new generation, but it's only going to get built if there's clarity that we're going to need it going forward. And so all of these things are interlinked. The need for new transmission, the need for electrification strategy, the need for a commitment to decarbonize the grid and carbon pricing, the regulatory and market reform that we talked about. All of those things form an admittedly complex sort of package of measures that need to come together to enable something of this scale and speed to occur. If any one of those things doesn't happen, it really puts at risk our ability to move forward. And that's why we wanted to put it out there and say, look, we talk a lot about net zero. The science tells us we absolutely have to move to net zero. If we're at all serious about that, you have to look at the scale and the speed with which we have to move now. And the honest answer is we need to have gotten started yesterday, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever you want to say. But since we didn't do that, we need to get started now and in a really serious way to do that. And that's the message we're trying to do. And, it's going to require collaboration. It's going to require cooperation. And in fact, in some ways, that's the area where we've got to start. The science has been very clear to say net zero is where we need to move. The federal government has been very clear in saying net zero is where we want to move. We don't yet hear that from every province. There's some provinces that don't talk about net zero at all. And in that context, unless we have a common vision around the objective that we're trying to achieve, in the absence of that, it's going to be a lot harder to develop a strategy that gets us there. So, but I think the science is very clear now. It's increasingly difficult, when you have Fortune 500 companies, when you have the Oil Sands Net Zero Alliance, when you have a whole group of organizations that are now rallying around net zero, if we can complete that circle and get everybody tied into the goal, I have absolute confidence that we have a lot of smart people who can help us, design the pathway to get there. But we need to agree on where we're going. And we're getting closer to that, I think, all the time.
Clean electricity is one goal. It's very important to getting to net zero. But sometimes people forget how important clean electricity is to the other big sectors that need to also be decarbonized.
Yeah, it's critical. And it's been consistently demonstrated to be critical in every analysis one looks at. At the end of the day, I mentioned earlier, electricity only accounts for 8% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions today. So decarbonizing it is important. It's great. And it means we've got 8% gone. We still have 92% to go. And where's that 92%? Well, it's sitting in transportation, it's sitting in our buildings, and it's sitting in industry. And there are a range of solutions that you can take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in those sectors. But electricity in many applications is clearly the most cost-effective solution going forward. And you see that in transportation with the rapid shifting that's occurring, for example, towards electric vehicles amongst manufacturers, amongst consumers, amongst the people in the supply chain who want to move that forward. In buildings, the heat pumps are the future. It's where we're going to end up going. And those are now increasingly cost competitive with any other alternative going forward. In heavy industry, it's sometimes more challenging. There are some industrial sectors, and I mentioned earlier, aluminum and steelmaking, where there's clearly a role where electricity alone can help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In others, it might be more complex, but even there, decarbonized electricity can play a role because in many of those situations, we're going to be looking to hydrogen to do that. And you can use decarbonized electricity to produce green hydrogen, the lowest carbon intensity hydrogen, the hydrogen that is going to be in most demand by the time we get to 2050, and is something, again, where decarbonized electricity is going to play a central role in enabling that going forward. So this is why I'll just use we talked about our vision here, but I want to just go back and talk about the International Energy Agency earlier this year released its first ever net zero pathway. And in that document, it said wind and solar worldwide account for about 9% of total electricity generation today. And they said, if we're going to get to net zero, by 2050, wind and solar need to account for 68% of total generation in an electricity grid that's 2.5 times bigger than the electricity grid of today. So this is very clear evidence of why wind and solar are going to be central to this transition. And energy storage plays a central role because it's a key enabler of wind and solar by helping us to use that wind and solar in a way that maintains the reliability of the grid.
Well, if you listen to Bloomberg, Robert, we're on track. There's an optimistic note there. In 2019, they predicted 77% of global investment in power generation would be renewable between then and 2050. 2 years later, we're on track. It's actually 78 or 80% of global investment in the last couple of years in power generation has gone to renewables. So I guess at least that's one positive sign. I think the biggest challenge might be, rounding up all these stray cats we call provinces and getting them on a shared vision where they're actually collaborating, which, as you said, is one of the most important things we need to do.
Yeah, I think it's again, as I said, if I have absolute faith in finding a solution if we all agree on the problem. And so that's really, in some ways, the first step that we need to work towards. And, it's absolutely true what you mentioned about Bloomberg in terms of where we're seeing the investment now. We can't be complacent because in the end, what matters is not the investment this year, the investment next year, it's the investment over the next 30 years. This has to be sustained. It has to be maintained going forward. And again, we have in Canada massive untapped wind and solar resources, like in every part of the country, right? So we can capitalize on this. But to fully do that in the most efficient way requires the elements that we talk about in the to-do list to capture that potential, to enable us to move forward. And as I said earlier, markets are pushing things in the right direction. I think it's fair to say at this point in time, but markets alone aren't going to do it unless we give them the freedom and the scope to be able to do that, create the frameworks to allow them to operate, and recognize that the electricity regulatory framework, market framework that we have today was built for an electricity system of the past and will not work for the electricity system of the future. And so there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done to not plan all of this that has to happen, but to create the conditions that allow private investors to go out and make the decisions that we need to enable us to achieve our net zero goals.
Well, I think one of the wisest things I've heard and learned in the last number of years is you have to be flexible and innovative, because the solutions next year will be even better. And we'll have to be able to adapt to those solutions. Robert, very interesting report. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk about it. I just have one more question. In your report, you talk about how much wind needs to be built annually, how much solar needs to be built annually. Was that projection based on just projecting forward the current economics or the needs of the grid? What drove that mix?
It reflects in part, you mean the mix between wind and solar specifically? Yeah. That is a reflection really of what we have seen from the net zero studies that have been undertaken to date. So in essence, what happens in those studies is that usually wind is outpacing solar in terms of contributions to new generation going forward Sometimes the ratio is 8-to-1, sometimes the ratio is 5-to-1. We landed somewhere in the middle in terms of that. And the factors behind that are the differing capacity factors behind the technologies and the fact that the quality of the resource going forward. So Canada has some excellent solar resources and is going to capitalize on those. But overall, across the country as a whole, it does not have the same solar resource as, for example, the United States. We have a very excellent wind resource in that regard. We do note in the report that that ratio between wind and solar will ultimately be determined by economics. And as the costs of solar continue to come down, you could expect that gap to close going forward. And as you mentioned earlier, these technologies are evolving so quickly that, you look at any projections that have been done over the last, frankly, 30 years about wind and solar and their cost and their growth, we continually underestimate what has actually happened. The technology continues to, on a very steady and continuous basis, continues to exceed our expectations in terms of what we think is going to happen. And I expect that will continue going forward. So we presented a snapshot, a vision of what can happen. We're not saying this is exactly what will happen, but it's in the ballpark. And that's why we need to start planning for this sort of scale and speed of transition right now.
So as we close up, Robert, what signals are you looking for to say that this is on track? What do you need?
Well, I think, we're looking to see, for example, from the federal government, the election commitment of the Liberals to move to a non-emitting grid by 2035 through a clean electricity standard, for that to be implemented and put in place as quickly as possible. We would like to see at the federal level carbon pricing modified so that existing natural gas generation faces some exposure to the carbon price and is not largely sheltered as it is now. At the provincial level, we already see work underway to look at how we can modify regulatory and market structures. What we're saying we need there is an acceleration. We need to increase the pace of our efforts in that regard. The Canadian Institute for Climate Choices looked at 60 different scenarios for how you could get to net zero. And they said that decarbonizing the grid and electrification represent safe bets because they show up in every scenario. And they said that what we need to be doing while we're trying to figure out if some technologies might work in the future going forward is we need to be doubling down on the safe bets. We need to go now because no matter which pathway we ultimately end up on, we're going to need a lot of this stuff. So that focus and acceleration is going to be critical. More discussion and collaboration around transmission and regional planning is going to be important. And again, there are some positive signs there. In Atlantic Canada, we see discussions around the Atlantic Loop and moving forward with that. We have seen a lot of discussion between Saskatchewan and Manitoba in terms of more closely integrating those grids. Those again are positive steps. What we need is an acceleration. And I guess on the electrification side, I'd say this is maybe where we have a bigger step to take. We see a lot of individual sort of one-off initiatives. Somebody has an incentive to purchase EVs. This car manufacturer is going to build only EVs by date X. This private provider is going to build some charging stations here and there. We need a more comprehensive strategy that provides confidence that we will be able to move forward with that fully electrified or largely electrified transportation network by the time we're at 2035 and have that power to enable that. So again, there's a lot of work to do. Absolutely no doubt about it. It's not that we're not doing anything. It's that we're not doing it fast enough considering where we need to go. And so we called our report a call to action. And that's really what it's meant to be. It's meant to signal the urgency at this point with which action is required. We can't take 5 years to figure out the next step. We need to move more quickly so that in 5 years, we're actually well into implementation of whatever that pathway turns out to be.
Robert, great work. And thank you very much for taking the time. I look forward to seeing how this all turns out.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. And yes, it's something we all need to be monitoring going forward.
Solar and wind are booming in Canada right now without subsidies. But what's needed is a 9-fold increase in clean energy development in order for Canada to get to net zero. Former Governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, calls energy transition to net zero emissions the greatest commercial opportunity of our age. Clean energy may be good business, but the scale of the effort to get to net zero requires serious policy support to rapidly deploy the investment required. For the latest on energy transition solutions, subscribe to Green Energy Futures today and check out our web channel at greenenergyfutures.ca. For Green Energy Futures, I'm David Dodge.